All right, welcome back, everybody, to episode 6 of Office Hours with Carp and Loge, the final episode of season 1. We do 6-episode seasons because that's what we decided to do. We'll be back in 2 weeks with episode 1 of season 2, and there'll be some changes. We're not going to tell you what they are.
Well, what are we calling season 2?
It is summer school.
That's right. Season 2 will be summer school because we are 2 professors and we insist that you go along with the bit.
That's why we're here. We're going to talk about the role your t-shirt plays on that in a moment. But first, for those who don't know us, I am Peter Loge, an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University and a strategic communications consultant. And I'm joined, as always, by my colleague,
Dave Karp. I am an associate professor at the very same school where I make a lot of jokes on Twitter and also read back issues of Wired magazine. It's Office Hours with Karp and Loge, where you talk to 2 professors, even though it's the summer now and you should have something better to do.
and you can tell, one of the reasons you can tell we're in summer school, not in classes, because Dave is not wearing a button-down shirt because he only does that to show respect. Instead,
I'm wearing my nicest, this is my best Mountain Goat shirt that I'm wearing so we can end this season on a high note.
Against type, we're going to end on a high note. All right. So what do we got going on? We've got, let's start with callbacks to some of the reviewing some of what happened in season 1. Mm-hmm. We kicked off our podcast with talking about Ukraine and how should advocates talk about anything other than Ukraine, and if so, how? And Dave, you made a really good point in episode 1, which folks can find online, saying that advocates should read not just the room, but also read the clock. Explain what you mean and how should they be reading the clock now?
Yeah, so I think the point then was a war had just broken out. And even if you're not an organization that is focused on war, which is most advocacy organizations, it's important to recognize the moment you're in and like take those automated tweets off automated posting, recognize that this moment isn't about you, and either find a way to help or just find a way to sort of clear space. And then what we talked about is, okay, well, when do you stop doing that? Because your mission is still important. And the answer is that you read the room, you read the clock, and you figure out at what point is this not the thing that everyone's talking about. And what we've seen over the past few months, the war is still going on, but clearly the clock has moved to a point where while it's still vital and important, it is not the central thing that everyone kind of needs to focus on. In fact, we've had several things since then. Hell, they lead to the decision that they're going to strike down Roe. That was a hell of a moment. Like we've been through some stuff during this first 6 episodes of this podcast. So recognizing that and recognizing when can we return to doing our thing without it seeming tin-eared. Yeah, we're back there now.
And I think this also brings up a critical question for strategic communication professionals and for advocates in general, which is how do you keep your focus on the thing on which you're supposed to be focused when all this other stuff is going on, mm-hmm. right? So if you're working on environmental issues, you want to make way for Ukraine because it'd be tin-eared to not talk about, to try to get your message out when the big news and important thing happening is Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But that doesn't mean you have to chase Ukraine. What it means is you've got to take a beat. Maybe that's time to go back to your core lists. Maybe that's time to really focus on your base. And then when the news window clears up a bit, when the news shifts to other topics, then you just continue to focus on the environment and keep doing what you're doing. Don't chase the most recent story unless there's a clear hook. If there's a clear hook, tie to it. If not, focus, right? It's a real challenge, I think. You and I both seen this in organizations with which we've worked. If you're working on something like the environment, the temptation is to make everything about the environment and chase everything, which doesn't work, right? Because then you're too diffuse. At the same time, you've got to be aware of what's going on around you and build it into your strategy as it makes sense. And finding that sweet spot is really, it's difficult, but it's also critically important.
Right, yeah. And I think recognizing, like, if you're a comms professional, not every day needs to be public comms, right? Like the week when actually it's not useful for us to put out a message and trying to explain how, well, war is an environmental issue, so let's all focus on that and give to our organization, that's not going to go over well with your supporters for good reasons. Like that's not a message that you as a human being would want to receive either. That's maybe if you're working on some big report that's going to come out in a few months, or you've got a conference coming up, spend that week focused on the internal work of planning the conference or writing the report. Like you don't get the week off, but you can focus on it. You've got time to do other things because you can recognize this moment isn't about us and let's respect the moment, but also know that it's just a moment.
Right. So Ukraine, read the room, read the clock. True, not just for Ukraine, but for all sorts of other issues. What are some other topics you want to revisit from earlier in the earlier podcasts?
I mean, I think the discussion about DeSantis and Disney is one to really kick around a bit, right? So that was one where you were pointing out that if you're Disney, you basically want this to go away, right? And you're going to send messages saying this is ridiculous. State legislators, like, sure, have your fun, get on Fox News, but then knock it off. And I think I predicted, like, yeah, it's not actually going to pass. And then 6 hours after we had our conversation, it passed because I'm bad at guessing things, I guess. But I think that sticks out because this is now looking like a win to Florida Republicans. And Chris Rufo, who's the Republican political strategist who was behind their entire push against critical race theory, is saying, that was a great way to push back against woke corporations. Because apparently other companies are now looking around saying, how do we make sure we're not the next Disney?
Yeah, I think what's important here, a couple of lessons here. One is for communications professionals, we're having two different conversations, right? DeSantis really doesn't care. He's not talking about corporate tax structure or tax breaks for entities or public policy. As you said during the episode, he wants to get on Tucker Carlson and he wants to be president of the United States, right? And so his argument is, look, I'm picking fights with big famous people because I'm a tough guy. Look at me picking the fight. Disney just wants to keep printing money. So their argument is, no, help us print money. And then advocates are jumping on the Disney side saying, see, Ron DeSantis hates, gay youth. Oh my gosh. And they're having two entirely different conversations because they've got two different goals in the conversations. In a perfect world, I think DeSantis would have Disney maintain its tax status because it's probably better for his state and there's, lower unemployment and all of that. And again, Disney's job isn't to make a point about American society. Disney makes money. And this isn't a new thing that they're big in the LGBTQ plus community, right? They renamed their rainbow collection the Pride collection. And that doesn't happen overnight, right? That's years probably in the planning and repackaging and ordering material and all this kind of stuff. They do it because turns out gay people, like straight people, think Disney's fun, right? And that's what they want to keep doing. So as advocates jumping into either side of this debate, I think need to understand the goals of everybody else in the debate, right? And pay attention to those goals and recognize and don't chase squirrels. I mean, you're sort of chase what matters, not what appears to be in front of you.
Right. The thing I'd add with that is advocates should also be clear on what their own goals are and decide whether it's worthwhile. Like as advocates, our goal isn't let's help Disney and look, I've got a 4-year-old, so of course I like Disney. We could do an entire special episode where I talk about the plot holes in Encanto. By the way, I've got a lot of opinions about the plot holes in Encanto. Great show, great film, bunch of plot holes we should talk about. So like as a dad, yeah, I like Disney a lot. As an advocate, they're one of the biggest companies on earth. They don't really need my help. But if we can recognize, okay, what is the governor doing? What's he trying to achieve? What are the downstream harms going to be? What's Disney likely to do? And how can we nudge this giant corporation so that their actions end up aligning with my values and my goals? If you see a path to doing that, get in there. Otherwise, make some jokes on Twitter, then move on to your thing.
I think you're right. It's focusing on the outcome you want, right? And your outcome, as you said, isn't to defend Disney. Disney doesn't need our help. Yeah. Actually, they probably kind of do in this crisis comms moment, but not for the broader sense of public justice. And again, they're not in it for social justice.
And again, like, while this isn't the fight that they wanted, they've got Star Wars stuff coming out on Disney Plus. They've got She-Hulk coming out on Disney Plus. Like they're fine. They're going to be fine. There's no world in which they're not printing money still in 2025. They're fine.
This also, though, speaks to something broader, and I'm glad you brought up critical race theory that Nat Kendall Taylor wrote about. He runs Frameworks Institute, which is a nonprofit, but basically an advising firm that looks at how issues are framed and how to frame them to get social action moving on them. And he wrote a piece for the Communications Network that I will throw in the on peterloge.com podcasts for our footnotes, called More Common Sense, Less Ideology, Modern Communications Lessons from Critical Race Theory Debates. And in it, he argues, and I'm quoting here, instead of addressing people's concerns and appealing to their aspirations, many leaders and communicators either got caught in the weeds talking about things that most people don't care about, or dismissed pushback as coming from ill-informed outliers, right? And his argument is clever quips and saying, no, that's not what CRT really means. You don't really get it. They don't even teach that. Kind of misses the point. Right? Go to why are people responding to, oh my gosh, critical race theory? What concerns do people have? And how can we as advocates, progressive advocates, address those concerns in ways that are positive rather than negative? Right? Because the point isn't getting the accurate definition of CRT. That's, I mean, setting aside, all the linguistic philosophy stuff that I really dig, and it's a floating signifier and all of that. It's just not very useful. Right, because if the point is you want to dismantle some of the structures that have locked in racism, and you want people to be less racist, let's focus on that.
Right, and if you're going to, like, I can see a strategic point in noting that CRT isn't taught in schools, in calling the people who are pushing this fools and idiots, and the strategic point comes up if what you're trying to do is show, look, they're lying to you because they're trying to push this other agenda. But that means you need that second part. If all you're doing is saying, well, it turns out if we really look at this, that what's being taught in elementary schools isn't critical race theory. If that's where you're ending, then you're not ending the right place. If you're using that to set up the real punch, the turn to, here's what's really going on, and that's getting you on message, then I think you're in good shape.
As I agree. And as Nat writes, speaking to what people are worried about resonates, while rhetorical quips and barbs make it seem like communicators don't get the point, or worse, they don't care. Because if you're telling me, no, you have the definition wrong, you're now lecturing to me, you're condescending to me, you're not hearing me when I'm saying, look, I'm super concerned that schools, like everything, the wheels seem to be coming off of everything here, and I can't quite articulate how or why, and this guy came in and said, aha, this is how or why. So he's giving me a place to locate my fear. So I'm going to run with that because at least I can hang on to it.
Sure.
Like don't grab the thing they're hanging on to. Grab the reason why they feel like they need to hang on to something. Right? Address the fears, address the concerns, but do it in a way then that's positive, which it turns out is more popular. Right? I mean, parents want their kids to learn the true history of America. They want to learn, America's a good place and can get better, but come on. So I think anyway, I'll throw that in the links. It's a terrific piece, and that is super smart. Any other callbacks?
I don't think Elon Musk is going to buy Twitter after all. And also, the way things are going, he is going to burn the stock valuation of Tesla. Like, it's going to be maybe 20, it's going to be maybe 20% of what it was. Some of that is because of the entire the tech stock downturn going on right now. But some of it is Tesla's valuation was built on Elon Musk's image as Iron Man. And I cannot recall a time when someone so spectacularly set their image on fire because they were bored and a little lonely. So that's been fun and interesting to watch.
And one of the things that struck me, that jumped out at me from the revelations about his sexual misconduct, I guess that's what it's called, is that he made profoundly inappropriate comments to a flight attendant.
I think he'd say it was just some horseplay. But
he offered to buy her a horse. What a weird, hey honey, buy you a horse. What kind of opening line is that? I don't know. I mean, of all the terrible things, the thing that struck me is like, that's your go-to, is gonna buy you a horse. Fascinating. The universe of things I don't understand is large and ever expanding.
Well, that's what I
Uh,
always say about you.
that's,
All right, should we move on to news of the week?
oh, please.
past 2 weeks?
Let's the last two callbacks I do want to check some boxes here. Bedoya was confirmed to the Federal Trade Commission, which is good news for people who want to use, who want to go after big tech and are interested in antitrust. And
Or in general, think it would be nice for the government to be able to govern.
For example, Gigi Sohn's nomination to the Federal Communications Commission is still in limbo. Stay tuned. That might end up being like a season 3 conversation.
Yeah, that ends up being good news for people who want government not to be able to govern.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah. All right. Before we get to, we got some other ending notes. We'll end with the ending notes, but let's talk about the news of the past 2 weeks. You first.
Yeah. I thought you were going to go. I thought we were going to talk about this Facebook expose that just came out first.
Yes. Yes, we were.
We are, because you find this fascinating, right?
I have a written down.
So this is news. You again. I just want to keep reminding you. Maybe we'll land this on land this plane in season 2 of the podcast. Podcasting is not a visual medium.
It's on YouTube. You can subscribe on YouTube.
Oh yeah. Okay, so there's a story in the Washington Post right now, a big expose about the advocacy that Facebook has set up with big piles, like big bags with just dollar signs printed on the side. And they use that to set up a massive network of advocacy organizations with different names who at the national level and the local level in all sorts of states are saying, you know what we really like is Facebook. Please don't regulate them. Tell us about the things that you find shocking here.
Nothing. I find nothing shocking about this at all. I find nothing shocking. So the Washington Post story, which I will again throw at peterloge.com podcast in the footnote section, headline is Facebook quietly bankrolled the small grassroots groups to fight its battles in Washington. Records show Facebook funded American Edge-backed minority interest groups, conservative think tanks, and small business groups to create the appearance of opposition by grassroots groups to antitrust legislation. The key to any successful strategic communications effort is identify your clear and identifiable goal. What's a win? In this case, it's maintaining the status quo for them. It's no antitrust legislation. It's leave us alone. We're just fine. Who has power over that? And that's Federal Trade Commission, and that's Congress. And there's a handful of people in Congress, right? It's committee chairs, it's ranking members, it's Senators Schumer, McConnell, Speaker Pelosi, Minority Leader McCarthy, a handful of others. It's not 535 of them, right? It's a relatively narrow group of them. What do they find persuasive, and from whom do they find it persuasive? Then deliver that message, and as many different ways as you can, right? And so what Facebook has done is what a lot of companies have done, as the Post points out. I think expose should be in air quotes. The Post pointed out what happens, how policy advocacy happens in this country. If you have a lot of money, it happens the way Facebook does it, pharmaceutical companies, telecommunications companies, tobacco, and others. And that is you find local groups in local places represented by people with power over your goals. And you say, hey, you know, this thing is happening. Like they want to break up Facebook. I don't know. Here in this community, Facebook seems really important because it connects people who otherwise might not be connected. It provides a lifeline. You know, during COVID, it's how families kept in touch with, like whatever the thing is, and say, you know, your voice would be uniquely valuable in this, would like to help you amplify your voice. Then American Edge writes a check and says, we'll help you do comms. And they co-author op-eds, maybe with a local official and a federal official saying, hey, here in, you know, whatever your hometown is, this really matters. And you've got a lobbyist knocking on a door or knocking on a Zoom. Lobbying is super complicated with security and COVID. They're saying, hey, you know, I get all the pushback against Facebook, and, you know, there are parts of it that make me uncomfortable, but really, it really matters in rural areas like the one you represent, especially among your communities. In fact, X number of people in your community rely on Facebook for Y numbers of things. You know, we really think that breaking it up or doing all this bad stuff would really hurt your community. Next thing you know, there's an op-ed in the local newspaper from a local leader saying roughly the same thing that the lobbyist then gives to the staffer going, hey, look at this. And every time the representative or the senator turns around, someone is saying, you know, Facebook is, I know it's got its problems, but it matters to me here, right? It's inside, outside. You fund conservative and liberal organizations. You just create this noise, and it's not universal noise. It's noise that matters to people who matter, and in places where it matters to them. I'm going to use this Washington Post story in my strategic political communications class. Those of you students listening, taking the class in the fall, get a jump on the reading. It's like 1,000 words. It'll save you 12 minutes. But I think if this is a case study, and if you have enough money, how campaigns are run. And if you don't have money, you come as close to this as you can.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I add on. I mean, it's a well-reported story. I don't want to bash the story because it's a well-reported story. I would say, like you, this struck me as something that I assumed would have been going on. Yeah. Because they note in the story that this is the same set of plays that you see from Big Tobacco and from a bunch of other like actually terrible corporations. And that's true, but it's also, like you said, because this is what you do when you are a big incumbent player, you're trying to protect the status quo, you have a terrible reputation, so you don't want to have these messages come from your organization, but you've also got giant bags of money. Like, you go and you set up an organization like American Edge, or you fully fund an organization like American Edge, and they go out and find in the districts of people, they go find in communities of people who live in the district of a decision maker, they find people who will also echo this message so it sounds local. Like, of course they're doing this. The two things that I would add, one is that we should know that this is still bad. And in particular, I listen to a set of tech podcasts that for over a year now have featured advertisements from Facebook saying, look, we, Facebook, think that you should regulate the internet. We are in favor of that, and we're going to work with lawmakers to do it. It's not surprising they have those ads either, but that's the reason why we should have kind of guffawed when you heard them. Yeah, that's right. I just said guffawed. Apparently I'm 90 years old. But they're also going to be spreading those messages, because the message from these companies is always, of course we invite regulation, but can we please be the ones who decide what those regulations are? They should never be anything that we don't like, because if you made us do something we don't like, then China, which is basically their message here. The other thing that stands out to me is that this mostly works when what you're trying to do is defend the status quo. It is much easier to use this strategy to convince lawmakers, you know how you're really bad at actually doing anything? This is another spot to maybe just don't do anything, because who knows what would happen. That's a pretty easy message to drum through. If instead, if you were like the advocacy coalition that's trying to get serious regulations passed, we shouldn't pretend that this is an even playing field. It is harder to do something big and new than it is to gum up the works and prevent anything new from happening. But the last thing that I would note is this would have been a really surprising strategy from Facebook in 2014, right? And that's because in 2014, Facebook was still a popular company. So the other thing that I would note to other companies out there or advocates out there who are like, oh yeah, you just do this and you're great, you're fine. The reason why Facebook is spending all of this money now is because they are worried. And they're worried because they have managed to get themselves so ungodly unpopular that now there's a real chance of major legislation going through or actual antitrust action. And if you want to avoid that, then maybe don't let your reputation turn to such shit to begin with.
So three things occur to me in this, and I think I agree with most of it. The first, I think in reverse order. The first is reputation maintenance matters. Mm-hmm. Don't wait until people hate you to make them like you.
Right.
Tech has learned this again and again and again. They had no DC lobbyists until they were in trouble when they hired every DC lobbyist. Mm-hmm. Like at some point, like if you were a lobbyist and you didn't know somebody lobbying for Microsoft, you should probably go get a different job in a different industry, because clearly you don't know enough people to be a good lobbyist. I never lobbied for Microsoft, but I know a lot of people who did. And it wasn't because I'm above all of that. I'm just saying, I just wasn't called.
It's just because you're kind of friendless.
No, I had different friends. I have different friends. I have other friends. So that's part one.
Imaginary friends. Sorry, continue.
I have my books. The second part, I see now I got distracted. The second thing, which is not in order, is you made me forget is that I'm not sure this is necessarily nefarious.
Mhm.
I mean, I've done this, not with this much money or this many resources, but you can't run a national campaign. Oh, I remember the third thing. We'll get to that. Anyway, you can't run a national campaign on everybody all the time. Nobody, not even Facebook, has that much money. And it's also just not worth it, frankly. You find a couple of people who matter, right? And so if it's the chairman of a committee who you need to protect a tax incentive for renewable energy, for example, you find a reason to highlight renewable energy in that legislator's state or congressional district. Maybe you find a local mayor and you say to the mayor, hey, look at this factory you've got making this amazing stuff. We'd like to highlight you for the amazing work you're doing. Can we come and give you a plaque? Can we get a tour? We'll invite the congressional delegation. We'll try to place an op-ed. We'll get you to co-author an op-ed in the local paper talking about what a national leader you are. Mr. Mayor, would you be willing to do that? Mr. Mayor will say, of course I will. Right? You then go to the state senator or to the US senator or to the representative and say, look at this amazing thing. This mayor loves you. Look at the jobs in your district, and they're much more likely to protect it. This is how campaigns go. You figure out who needs to be persuaded of what they find persuasive, from whom, and you do that. Your third point, which was your second point, but the third in the order in which they occur to me, is that inertia matters. Right? It's Newton's laws work in politics. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. It's much easier to prevent things from happening. And part of it is not just the solution could be worse than the problem, but it's complicated. We've got to study it. I don't know. It's hard. Like what? It's hard. So you don't do it. And a lot of lobbying dollars in Washington historically have been spent to prevent bad things from happening, just to maintain the status quo. Some lobbying dollars are leaving DC because nothing's happening with or without the lobbyists. So they're shifting their dollars, and advocates are shifting their attention to the states where things actually are happening, which can be good news if it's building roads or upgrading broadband or something. Or it's also to prevent bad things from happening at the state level. So I think knowing, do you need to keep a big rock in place or do you need to get a big rock rolling? Or it's like, that's a critical thing to know from the jump. I think it's an interesting little case study.
Yeah. And I think that's also a good pivot to the other thing I wanted us to talk about today. Because what stands out to me, the reason why both of us react to this study saying, yeah, and of course they're doing that. They're looking at Facebook and what they're facing. I would be surprised if it would be malpractice if they weren't setting up some organization to do all of this work for them. It's what you do when you're in that position. That's all against the backdrop of this is how strategic politics works in America, right? Like in particular, the founders designed a system that has a bunch of checks and balances, which just like all of the veto points means that it's really hard to get something new done. It's really easy to block things. Like that is, take a political science, like an American politics class, that will be at least 2 lectures in any American politics intro class, is all the veto points and why it's so hard to move things through. The system of government where it's really easy to move things through is autocracy. If you have an autocracy and a single government that just does shit on its own, it's very easy for it to move things through. And also it tends to be corrupt stuff that goes terribly. And I want to note that because the other thing that we've occasionally talked about over the course of this pod, and we'll certainly be talking about during season 2 and definitely in season 3 in the fall, is we're heading into the 2022 election. And I think I said on an earlier pod that while the 2022 election is going to be bad for Democrats, most likely, I mean, it's going to be bad. Yeah. We don't know how bad. And the one reason to think it might be less bad than it's looking on paper right now is over the course of the spring, it's been specific Democrats against generic Republicans. And once we have the Republican primaries get cleared, we're going to have specific Democrats against specific Republicans who are able to win a Republican primary, which probably means having a support from Donald Trump. And that's taking shape now. And I think it calls out just how high the stakes are. So I'm thinking particularly of Pennsylvania, which just had its primary. And the guy who got through as the gubernatorial candidate for the Republicans is this guy, Doug Mastriano, who we can drop a note into, drop a link, but Doug Mastriano funded a bunch, he's a state senator right now in Pennsylvania. He was the leader of the Stop the Steal movement in Pennsylvania. He tried to decertify the election. He paid for a bunch of buses to January 6th. I've seen reporting, I think, that he may have been at the January 6th rally himself. Like, this guy is one of the extreme conspiracy theorists. And so we're going to have a specific Democrat saying, all right, like, elect me governor and I'll be a Democratic governor, versus a specific Republican who, if elected, will make sure that the Pennsylvania's votes all go to Trump, regardless of how many Pennsylvanians vote for the Democrat. Democracy is on the ballot in 2022. And also, democracy is not a great issue to be running on, because people don't want to vote on democracy. They want to vote on things like, is there a recession right now? Or did schools get closed down because of COVID, or shit, monkeypox, whatever the hell that is. So it's not great. Like, a thing that's happening here that has really strong echoes to, I think, 2016 is, on the one hand, if you're a Democrat and you have to run against somebody, you would probably narrowly like to run against a Doug Mastriano, because he's going to be so audaciously extreme in ways that serve up for voters that it's very important that you vote against this guy, unless you are the hardest right Republican and you've decided that you don't want elections anymore. That is narrowly useful, and narrowly you can even hope that maybe there's coattails. And also, that's exactly what everyone said in 2016, maybe correctly. In 2016, people were looking at it and saying, if Hillary Clinton has to run against somebody, run against Donald Trump, because that guy is a just gift horse spewing things out. Much easier running against him than like a Marco Rubio. But even if narrowly that's the person you want to run against, it also raises the stakes, because that person's an autocrat. So if Mastriano wins, then we have a swing state that no longer effectively votes in 2024. That's bad. That's how you get really quickly to autocracy. And in the short term, you're also looking at it and saying, like, yeah, okay, so like the stakes are higher, but also this is a slightly easier win. I think over the course of the summer, that's what we're going to see more and more of. We're seeing in Georgia, this is taking shape. In Michigan, it sounds like this might be taking shape. It sounds like a bunch of the more institutional Republicans might not qualify for the ballot because the signatures that they gathered may have been fraudulent. So we're shaping up, as we knew we would, to have a bunch of Stop the Steal people running and potentially winning. And if that happens, then all of the strategic politics that you and I have spent our career studying starts to go out the window, just because the normal system of government, where you have legislators who are worrying about the next election, starts to fall apart. This is a hair on fire moment in ways that are weird and uncomfortable, and we shouldn't ignore.
With that, we're just about at time. So season 2, we're going to pick that up because it's elected officials, candidates, behavior, incentives. If Stop the Steal people win primaries but lose elections, maybe behavior will change. In Georgia, the Trump-backed candidate basically bailed out with a racist swipe at Stacey Abrams on the way out the door, and Kemp is going to be the nominee. We'll see how all that plays out. We're going to come up more of this in season 2, which starts in 2 weeks. Set your clocks, set your timers. A couple of things on the way out the door before we go. The first is, I do want to note a passing of Donald Ross, co-founder of M&R Strategic Services. Donald is a friend. I used to be a senior VP over there, one of the leading public interest lawyers and advocates in the country. A big loss for the advocacy community, a real hero to progressives, whether they know it or not. The second thing we did not talk about, Congress actually held real life hearings on UFOs, which is weird. So from today's lesson, from today, read the clock, read the room, figure out, all the access points of communication. Facebook might be big and evil, or they might not be, depending on your perspective. But what they're engaging in is smart advocacy, and they're doing something that most advocates should probably be doing some form of. We're trying to, based on how many resources they have. And none of this matters if people who don't believe in democracy get elected. I think that's where we leave all this stuff, Dave.
That sounds about right. This has been I don't know if I want to say it's been a fun 6 weeks, since the world is worse than it was when we started this podcast.
Not our fault. Not our fault. Not our fault.
But that gets into the questions of agency and lack thereof. But yeah, if anything else, I think the stakes are high enough that it's important for people to at least fight as smart as we can, right? And if there's one thing to this podcast, it's understanding strategic politics so that you can fight the smartest battles you can.
There we go. With that great outline, that line out, I just blew it.
Outro.
Is that not true? Where can
Yeah.
people find you on the Twitters and on the Substacks?
On Twitter, I'm at Dave Karp, Karpf. On Substack, I'm davekarp.substack.com. I've been writing about a bunch of this stuff on Substack, and will continue to do so, along with a bunch of things about Wired Magazine this summer. How about
Follow
you?
him. I am at PLOGE, Ploge on Twitter, and peterloge.com/podcast. You'll get the links. You'll see us, and we will tune in 2 weeks for the exciting episode 1 of season 2. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, now.
Ba 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 ba.